Good morning, barbecue enthusiasts. It's a snow day. I have plenty of work to do at the desk, but I thought I'd make a YouTube video instead. This is one I've been thinking about putting together for a while. This applies primarily to anyone smoking meat at high elevations and my findings and observations. I've mentioned this in a few reviews of smokers I've done in the past, but I didn't really elaborate, and I thought it might be worth doing that. I haven't been able to find a whole lot of information on smoking meat at high elevation. I think primarily because most people who are living in a region at higher elevations aren't known for barbecue, and that's certainly the case here. I'm in a region that barbecue is not a thing. If you live at an elevation of 4,000 feet or less, that's kind of an arbitrary number, but 4,000 feet or less, this is probably not going to be of much use to you. I live in the Intermountain West, so if you're like me, it may be of some use to you. Not that the Intermountain West is the only place that has high elevations. I think there are one or two other spots in the world, but you get the idea. Before I get too much into the high elevation cooking stuff, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on my, the nexus and evolution of my barbecue. So I like to cook, but cooking for me is a means to an end. My wife doesn't cook. I do all the cooking for us, and I like to eat. In fact, when I do eat, I'm a trencherman, a gourmand, and barbecue lends itself very well to gluttony. For me, barbecue is it's kind of a hobby and recreational, and there's something cathartic about it as well. It's kind of nice to sit out in the afternoon and have a beer while you're watching your dinner gradually prepare itself. But again, it boils down to having something good to eat. I used to fly for a living and got to fly around the countryside quite a bit. I've been to all the popular barbecue regions, St. Louis, Texas, Kansas City. In fact, as a interesting side note for anybody who's not into aviation, it was either an arrival or an approach to I think it was an approach to one of the north runways there that had 3 consecutive fixes on the approach: spicy, barbecue, and ribs. So they take their barbecue seriously. But I've had St. Louis style, Memphis, of course, various locations in Texas, et cetera, so on and so forth. The only place I really haven't sampled any barbecue is the Carolinas, so missed out on that one. But not that I hadn't flown in there, but for whatever reason, never had any of their barbecue. But anyway, the long and the short of it is, I never really had any barbecue anywhere that was kind of knock your socks off type barbecue. It was good, don't get me wrong. But not anything where I'd fake an illness or an emergency to land in Memphis to get some barbecue. So it wasn't until I actually started doing my own barbecue that I really started falling in love with it. So I'm going to tell you a little story here. This is blasphemous, so you might want to skip ahead or cover your eyes and plug your ears. Well, there's nothing to see, so just plug your ears. So our idea of barbecue for a long time was to get a big stock pot, fill it with water, and yeah, that's right, throw some ribs in. I know, I told you, if you're still here, this is on you. And boil them for an hour. 2 is even better. Pull them out, slather them with some doctored, sugary, commercially available barbecue sauce, and throw them on the grill. Every now and then flip them over, do that for an hour or 2, slathering them with more and more barbecue sauce, and that was what we considered barbecue. So most in our area now would interchangeably use grilling and barbecue. I had for a long time wanted to get a smoker. I'd walk by the electric smokers in big box stores and kept putting it off because I didn't want to part with $300. If you've seen any of my smoker reviews, you know that's a mere drop in the bucket to what I've spent on smokers in the meantime. So, but that's another story. I really wish I'd gotten into this a lot sooner. I've been using smokers for a number of years now, but yeah, I really wish I'd figured out what I was missing sooner. My mother had gotten me this book back in the 90s sometime. It had to have been sometime just before or after Al Gore invented the internet. But this has got a lot of recipes and that sort of thing. I've never really read the book, but it kind of introduced you to that. What the hell is that thing? Never seen anything like it. And I kind of dismissed this whole thing because it was just so alien to me. But I wish I'd paid more attention to it, and I'm sure my mother would have too. She was like me. She was a foodie, Kansas farm girl, one of those old-fashioned family cooks. She put together some wonderful dishes without a recipe. Did it the same way every time, and it was to die for. I wish I'd inherited more of her stuff. So what happened is probably not long after Aaron Franklin released his book, I picked up a copy of it. At the time, I was still buying a lot of books on barbecue. I don't anymore. Like I say, I've kind of found my own system, and that's what I stick to. But I'd never been a big fan of brisket, unless it was in the form of pastrami or corned beef or anything like that. I'd see those big Packer briskets in the grocery store, and I was wondering, what the hell would anybody do with anything like that? So, as my smoking regimen continued to evolve, it was obvious people had everybody likes brisket. I never did very much. Even in the nicer barbecue restaurants, it was just kind of dry, flavorless meat to me. And very often you'd get it in the form of a sandwich, and they'd take the point and just chop it up, and so it was really fatty. I hate that. I don't like that. Greasy meat, good. Fatty, gristly meat, not good. So brisket is just something I ignored for a long time, but it's kind of the brass ring in barbecue, as anyone knows, and everybody else seems to like it. So I thought, well, I better give it a try. After reading Aaron Franklin's book, I thought, well, it doesn't sound like there's much to this at all. So I went out and bought a brisket at the grocery store locally. We don't have Prime around here. You could probably order it, but it kind of defeats the purpose of barbecue, in my opinion, anyway. The whole point is to take a undesirable, inexpensive piece of meat, cook it low and slow, and make it really desirable. So why go out and spend over $100 on a piece of meat? That just doesn't make any sense to me. So I usually try to get choice if I can, but sometimes all that's available is select, but I digress. I picked up a brisket and followed Franklin's method to the letter, and it turned out wonderfully. It couldn't have been much better. Maybe just a skosh underdone on the underside, since that's where the heat was coming from. I cooked mine fat cap up like Franklin does. I no longer do that. I start mine fat cap down, but my cookers, I should say, all of them, for the most part, cook from below, so some more than others, but neither here nor there for this. I did another brisket, also using the Franklin method. Turned out wonderfully. So, as well, in a classic example of Pride Before the Fall, we invited some friends over, and I put 2 briskets on the dinner. That's the only thing that I changed. Otherwise, I cooked the briskets exactly the way I had before. And by mid to late afternoon, it was, and I put these on early in the morning, and by mid to late afternoon, it was pretty apparent that dinner was going to be late. By early evening, it was apparent that dinner was going to be very late. By later that evening, we were eating a very late dinner, and our guests very politely gnawed on something the consistency of shoe leather, and pretended that they liked it, and to make me feel better, even took some home to feed to the neighbor's dog. I doubt they would have fed it to theirs. So disappointed in the outcome of that. It set me on a mission. In barbecue, of course, at least in the convention of barbecue, if the meat is tough, it hasn't been cooked long enough. So I started even earlier in the morning with a brisket, and cooked it all day, well into the evening hours. Still never got tender at all. The next one, before I finally gave up on it, the next one started even earlier. I was finally getting up to a point where I was cooking these things for 20, 22 hours, and they would just never get tender. I never could replicate the first 2 briskets I had done, and I couldn't figure it out. It was driving me up a wall. Again, following the exact same method, everything the same as I'd done with Aaron Franklin. So I started thinking this over very thoroughly. What had changed? And I was using, the meat, obviously, every cut of meat is a little different, but could it really be that different? The cooker was at the same temperature. I was using the same method, wrapping after the stall, et cetera, so on and so forth. And I just couldn't figure it out. The only thing that I could conclude was that there was some environmental influence. Well, my elevation hadn't changed. There had been no major earthquakes or anything that I'm aware of. We're still at the elevation we always had been. It's probably worth mentioning. We divide our time between two homes. One is located at an elevation of about 6,300 feet, the other at 8,500 feet. So, but I kind of got to thinking about the relationship of elevation on the boiling point of water. I still really didn't see how that could have anything to do with it, because you're trying to render the collagens and connective tissues and everything in the meat. So, but just out of curiosity, I went back to an aviation archive. They archive weather observations going back to whatever date you want. At the time, I was still taking notes on each cook that I did. So I could modify or see what I did right last time, modify it if I needed to, and that sort of thing. So I found the dates where I'd recorded the information on the original two cooks, went back into the archive, and indeed I found that the atmospheric pressure on those days were exceptionally high. I don't remember what they were now, but they were probably pushing 3.05 inches of mercury. And it's worth stating right now for you guys who aren't on the English system, sorry. If you're doing things in meters, hectopascals, millibars, or anything else, you're going to have to convert anything that follows. But everything here is going to be in inches of mercury and feet, because I'm a proud American. Here we had some circumstantial evidence that maybe atmospheric pressure was having some effect on the cook. It was at that time that I scoured the internet, all the cookbooks I had on hand at that time. All the cookbooks I had really didn't address anything other than it took longer to cook meats at high elevation, and the effects of high elevation on baking and that sort of stuff. I'm not a baker, so I wasn't interested in any of that garbage, but it really didn't give you any information. And anybody who remembers anything about their middle school science class knows that the boiling point of water decreases in temperature as you go up in elevation. Any sci-fi nut will know that your blood boils in a vacuum. So anyway, I knew that, but I really hadn't made that connection yet, but I was beginning to suspect by the time I found out that things were much better at high altitude. But then what do you do? You only wait until you have a forecast high pressure to cook your brisket. That ain't gonna fly. I guess before I get too much further down the road, I probably ought to go ahead and mention at this point just some of the science behind this. So again, having had an aviation background, I'm very, very familiar with the concept of pressure altitude. So again, and this is what went into my hypothesis, I guess, as far as postulating the effect of elevation and atmospheric pressure on my successful cooks as opposed to the other cooks. And what was happening with the successive cooks was the meat was drying out entirely before the meat ever got tender. It never reached a point where it got tender. And the meat would get up to an internal temperature of somewhere in the low to mid 190s. Never quite hot enough to really start rendering those collagens and that sort of thing before the damn thing dried out. So it became apparent to me that the only solution was to do the Texas crutch, something I'd very much resisted doing, especially since I had two successful cooks without it, using the Franklin method. But what it boils down to is that the boiling point of water drops by 2 degrees every 1,000 feet increase in elevation. And likewise, every tenth of an inch in mercury of atmospheric pressure is equal to 100 feet. So in standard atmospheric pressure is 2992, nines and twos as we called it or 29.92 to be exact, 29.92 inches of mercury, 2992 or nines and twos as we called it in aviation. So Any variation from that 0.92 from the 29 inches is going to be a, let's say you go up to 3012, you've now seen an increase. Let's see, better not get into any math here because I'm going to embarrass myself. Anyway, for every tenth of increase, tenth of an inch increase in inches of mercury or decrease, you're looking at a 100-foot change. As the pressure goes up, you're looking at a drop in an effective drop in elevation of 100 feet. For every tenth of an inch the mercury drops, you're looking at an increase of 100 feet. And you can multiply on that. I'm sure you can find formulas on that on the internet. So, but again, I wouldn't recommend doing that because unless you're going to plan all your cooks around the pressure altitude, which is your elevation corrected for non-standard atmosphere, it's pointless. We're looking for something that we can get consistent results. And again, that brings us back to the Texas wraps. So. And you can wait until after the stall. I don't do that anymore. I just wait until I have good color on the brisket and make sure I'm not drying the thing out before I wrap it and then wrap it. And one thing I do is I start with the fat cap down since my heat is coming from below. And then after I wrap it, I put it back on the cooker, fat cap up. So that rendering fat is kind of basting the meat and everything else. But I also, just like the Franklin method, I also wrap it in butcher paper first. So when I pull that thing off the smoker to wrap, it first goes into butcher paper and then it goes into the foil. Save you a couple of experiments by finding that your bark gets cooked off of it if you just put it in the foil and it's sitting there braising. Essentially is what it boils down to. It's braising in the foil. And but at least the butcher paper keeps some of that bark intact. It's definitely softer. There's no question of it than just doing it in butcher paper. But if you're like me, you're cooking at high elevation, you may be constrained to have to do that in order to get your brisket tender. And it does get tender. You won't necessarily, unless you have a very high atmospheric pressure, and depending on your elevation, of course. But you may never exceed 200 degrees. So it's my typical temperatures that I see when I pull my briskets off the cooker, and I'm pulling them off when they're jiggly and probe tender. It has nothing to do with the temperature, but the temperatures are typically in the mid to upper 90s. It's only on the rare occasion that we have a very high pressure over the area that I can see an internal temperature over 200. But it does keep enough of the moisture in the brisket to allow the collagens and connective tissues to render. So, and that's brisket. I don't do a whole lot of pork shoulders. They're not my favorite. They're typically ingredients for other stuff, pulled pork sandwiches, that kind of thing. And they're good. Don't get me wrong, but I can only take so much of that. It's the brisket, I can eat handful after handful after handful of that, and what little might be left, usually out of the point, I kind of separate it from the fat and then use that as ingredients for taco, burrito meat, chili, that sort of stuff. So, but the pulled pork is another matter. But the pulled pork I still wrap. I don't bother with butcher paper on that. Same deal. I wait until it has real good color, it has a nice bark on it. Then I wrap it in just heavy-duty foil, like you see here, and finish the cook that way. Once again, I'd never had any luck getting those done unless I put them in a pan and braised them with foil over the top of them or whatever, and you definitely lost your bark and flavor that way. So I just started putting them in foil, and that gets them to the point where they get extremely tender. They slide the bone out type stuff. So. But again, I don't do a whole lot of those, but it is a good way to do them at high elevation. Ribs are an exception. I don't wrap my ribs in foil. I figured that out way back on the electric smoker. I experimented with the various competition ways of putting brown sugar, honey, and the squeezable Mar Parquet on them in the deal. Doing it without all that, it didn't seem to matter a whole lot. Something about the pork fat when it renders and sits there and braises in that foil, it creates kind of almost it's an odor that I don't care for, and a flavor. It transfers to the meat. It's a little pungent, and I just don't like it. It makes cooking your ribs to a consistency you like them a little tougher at high elevation, but I do always wrap them in butcher paper once they've got good color on them. Those I do bone side down to start out with. After I wrap them, I cook them bone side up, and the butcher paper seems to provide enough cover that they still tend to braise in their own juices, as it were, without drying out too much, and they, for the most part, fall off the bone tender, which I know is too tender. So technically, if you're doing the competition style ribs, they're supposed to have a little bit of tug or pull to them or whatever. I'm not like that. I just soon have almost all the fat rendered out of them, just so you don't have globs of fat in it again. Still juicy, but most of the fat rendered out, and I don't mind if they fall off the bone. That's we all like them that way. So. But you can get them to that consistency, but you have to be careful because they're not wrapped in foil. They can dry out, so you have to be very careful about monitoring those. Again, I've gotten to the point where I can tell just by picking up the package whether they're done or not. They get real floppy, and it's a pretty good bet that they're done at that point. But if I'm not at all certain, I just take a toothpick and stick it in between the bones. If they grab at all, I know they get a little bit of time left. If it's pretty much butter soft, and you know they're done. So. And then poultry, I don't worry about wrapping at all. It gets done. You're cooking that to a lower temperature, of course, so it's not an issue at high elevations. So at least not at the elevations I'm cooking at. May get worse the higher you go. So hopefully, after I've edited all the mistakes I've made, this is going to make sense. I guess we'll see, and I hope it is relatively short. But in the end, I hope it's helpful. Again, I just didn't find much information on this when I was getting very, very frustrated with the briskets in particular. I'd be interested in hearing whether anybody else has any opinions or experiences with this. So it's just because I'm doing it this way doesn't mean it's the best way. If somebody's come up with something better, I'd love to hear it. And I'm jealous of all you guys down at lower elevations, especially those of you who have access to woods that we don't have around here, hickory and that kind of stuff. I'd love to get my hands on some of that. I do have a little pecan that came from Alabama. A buddy brought some back, so I've got to have him down here for some ribs or something cooked on that pecan here one of these days. I do have a little fruit wood around here too. It's hard to come by. I've been hoarding that. One of these days I'm going to do a whole cook with fruit wood, but otherwise we're using oak, which is fine. Our oak is Gamble oak. It's something that's very common in the Intermountain West. It grows in a variety of configurations. You get big old trees, but most of it's in the form of scrub brush. The nice big rounds seem to grow on private property, so it can be kind of tough to get that. And when somebody's selling it as firewood, it's expensive as hell. But that's about all we have. So anyway, I think I've pontificated long enough on that. If anybody has any questions, please let me know. No need to like or subscribe. That's not why I'm doing this. I'm just doing it to try to be helpful. So anyway. One other thing I wanted to mention while I was talking about books. This guy here, if I was going to buy one book on barbecue, this would probably be it. I keep one at both of our locations. So I can't say I like all of their recipes. Some of them get a little elaborate and some are just not my taste. But as far as the science of barbecue goes, a lot of good information there. They also do some videos on their website, and those are pretty good. I've gotten a lot of good information out of that. Found out a lot of stuff that I was doing wrong over the years. So, in fact, smoke ring development is one of the things I picked up on in there. So it's cold meat on a cooler smoker for a nice deep smoke ring. In fact, when I do ribs anymore, my ribs have a smoke ring that goes all the way to the bone. They're pink all the way through. So it's get a nice deep smoke ring on briskets, everything I do. So it's I avoid anything with acids in it, that sort of thing, anything that might inhibit the formation of the smoke ring, the nitrites, and all that kind of stuff that go, the byproducts of combustion from the wood that the acids kind of neutralize. So anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. I already say, anyway, hope this helps, guys. Enjoy. Have a dandy day.